The age-old methods of medical training are reaching their limits. The gap between evolving healthcare needs and traditional education is widening, leaving clinicians and healthcare professionals grappling with outdated tools. How do we make learning in healthcare more tailored and effective and evidence-based? And can technology help solve the skill and knowledge gaps that standard e-learning still struggles to fill? On the show today, THT Ambassador Ruby Hartley speaks to Dr. Marc Berg, Chief Clinical Advisor for Area 9 Lyceum, a company at the forefront of AI-driven adaptive learning. In this episode, we talk about the transformative power of adaptive learning in healthcare education, the evidence supporting the effectiveness of adaptive learning versus traditional methods, and the role that adaptive learning can play in enhancing clinical decision-making. Collaboration starts with a conversation. Team HealthTech, let's make it happen. This is Talking HealthTech with me, Peter Birch, featuring content and community about technology in healthcare.
Good morning, Marc. Morning for me. I don't know what time it is over there in the world where you are, but...
Yeah, mid-afternoon here in sunny California, Northern California. So good afternoon.
Thank you for coming on this Talking HealthTech podcast and having a conversation with me today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I guess to get things started, Marc, we just want to get you to tell us a little bit about yourself, where you've come from.
I'm a professor of pediatrics at Stanford University here in Palo Alto, California. I've been here about 7 years. My specialty specifically is pediatric critical care. So I've been in academic medicine about 25 years. I know it's hard to imagine that when you look at me, you might say maybe 5 or 6 years, but anyway, 25 years in academic medicine. Before this, I was at the University of Arizona and sort of climbed the whole academic ladder there, was a division director and et cetera, promoted to full professor and all that good, hard academic work that some of us enjoy doing. Originally from Minnesota in the far north of the U.S. and born and raised there and went to the university there. So that's basically my journey in academic medicine. My work with Area 9, which is the Danish company that makes Area 9 Lyceum Rhapsode, which is the adaptive learning software that we'll talk about today. Started an interesting story as I was a volunteer with the American Heart Association. I was the chairman of the Pediatric Committee on Resuscitation. And the founders of Area 9, before they founded Area 9, were working with the Heart Association on some of the earlier online learning technologies. So this goes back to 2006, something like that, 7, so quite a while. And then as they started their company, so many years ago now, Area 9, we recognized in each other a love of learning and a passion for healthcare education. Two of the founders happen to be doctors, medical doctors. And so we just kept in touch and sort of agreed, like, hey, when things come up in healthcare, let's see if we can work together. However many years later now, we are into it. 2007, it's quite a while. I guess my title is Chief Medical Advisor to Area 9 Group. So that's how I fit in here today.
You sound slightly qualified for that job, so that's good.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. We'll see. It's, it's something you learn as you go along, of course. But since adaptive learning hasn't been around that long, I guess, as you look back, I've been around since the early days. So, yeah, I guess so.
So your love for learning, Area 9 Lyceum. Talk to me. What is Area 9 Lyceum and how does it fit into healthcare?
So Area 9 Lyceum is the learning, the adaptive learning company within Area 9. Area 9 has some other things they do in custom software development, et cetera. But the core of Area 9 is Lyceum. The core of Area 9 is adaptive learning. And the company, as I mentioned, was founded, some years ago. And then in 2014, sold a large portion of its technology to McGraw-Hill, which was it's a large textbook or publishing company, textbook company traditionally. And so Learn Smart, and anyone who might have used a McGraw-Hill textbook in the last 10 years or so might have used something called Learn Smart, which is which is Area 9's technology that McGraw-Hill bought. So after that sale, then Area 9, changed course a little bit and started working hard on the next generation of adaptive learning technology, and that's where it is today. So that is Area 9 Lyceum, based both in Copenhagen, Denmark, and Boston here in the U.S. And the sort of the premier product of Area 9's adaptive learning suite of products is called Rhapsode. So it's that's the name of the adaptive learning software that Area 9 has created.
Sort of like a dinosaur. It sounds like a big bit of technology. Tell me what, in terms of adaptive learning, you keep using this adaptive learning conversation. So let's talk to the audience. What is adaptive learning and what's the significance of it?
I think a general answer to that question is just that anytime you take content or a way to deliver content and make changes to fit the specific needs of a specific student, that's adaptive. So it can be very broadly defined. I think, there's even sort of an analog form of adaptive learning that I like to talk about, which is when you've had a good professor and he or she is in front of the class, maybe for the first time, or if you're attending a lecture, they might say, who of you here are nurses? Who are doctors? What else do some of you do? How long have you been doing this? Does anyone know anything about this topic of sepsis or shock? So just 2, 3, 4, 5 questions that the skilled teacher would gather is going to change a lot about how that person delivers the content, right? If you found out that everyone was an advanced anesthesiologist, you'd have a different conversation about intubation than if everyone was a first day student in undergraduate, right? So you may still cover the same material, but wow, it's going to be presented in a different way and you're going to have a different approach to it. Adaptive learning, as we talk about it at Area 9, involves the software Rhapsode and involves a very unique approach to adaptive learning, which is unique in the field, which is a biologic approach. And, probably just a minute on that is worth going into if you think that would be helpful. Many people have experienced a type of adaptive learning that's inferential and basically hardwired. And so that's where you might you have a question put to you, and the software behind that question is coded in such a way that if you answer correctly, it makes a lot of assumptions about you and starts taking you in what seems like a very, hardwired, I think is probably the best way to say it, a firm path in a certain direction. And so it's rigid. It's not biologic. There's rigid branching points. The problem with that is the computer has to make assumptions about you that may or may not be correct. And also you may have other things come in that can really, frankly, just blow your learning experience. And I would think of something like accidentally clicking the wrong answer. Like, oh, I know that. I know that. But once you've clicked it, it's too late. The computer thinks you don't know it. And now you're going to be slavishly served, 5 more questions in that area. And it just feels sort of stilted. The biologic model that Rhapsode uses, and we have some really great, graphs I wish I, could pop up on my screen share and show you, but are just that. They're biologic. They're branching models. So there's no hard-coded branch points. So when I'm asked a question, we call them probes, meaning we're probing you to understand if you know something. When I ask you a question about a specific learning objective, and you perhaps don't understand that correctly, and you don't get the correct answer, then we're able to move around. We don't get stuck. We don't hard branch left or right. We're able to ask similar questions around that concept and see if we can use these educational techniques of supporting you where it seems you know something, and then trying to draw out a little more from you what you may or may not know. And so the learning looks very graphically. It looks very biologic. There will be a big, when we look at it in our graphs, there will be a big dot. That's a learning objective, and then lots of dots circling around that. And the amount of time you spent on a learning objective will be graphically represented as bigger or smaller. But it's fascinating when you look at it because you'll see, three learners, somebody who knows the material cold has a relatively linear line through all the material. Maybe there's one or two little double backs if they weren't totally sure, but they're moving clearly through it. Someone who doesn't know the material at all, it's much more like this beautiful branched out bush or flower, and they spend some time over here in this area, and then you can graphically see that a connection was made. The student understood this principle, and that helped them move forward. It's a long answer to your question, but I think it's obviously it animates me. I think it's exciting to think about this more enlightened way to make educational material adapt to a specific student in real time.
I think the visual learners out there really appreciated your description of that. So
yeah, I'm trying to do it with my hands, but you get the idea.
All the sense. It's not just a podcast here. We've got the graphics and the description. That's great. Look, I think in terms of being a health tech podcast and we're talking healthcare, so you're obviously over in the US and we're talking about Australian healthcare. We're obviously learning and adaptive learning and becoming more efficient in our learning are the real key things we're looking at as clinicians. My background being an ICU nurse, your background being an intensive care pediatric doctor. We're looking at how can we improve the knowledge at the bedside for our clinicians. And this is, I think, where I see and a lot of other people will see such a benefit in, I guess, adaptive learning and what that looks like. I guess for that to be a bit more understood in the general healthcare environment, whether that be in the US or Australia, do you have any examples or people that have used adaptive learning or Area 9 Lyceum and how they've used it for their clinicians?
Well, I think a couple examples come to mind immediately, and they're both with great partners in not just the U.S., but they're New England Journal of Medicine and the American Heart Association. So both of those organizations are global, and both use Area 9 adaptive learning software in their adaptive learning products. So Knowledge Plus is what New England Journal calls their product, and Heart Code is what the American Heart Association calls this technology. And, I think in those situations you see one is designed specifically for doctors to prepare for their board exams in internal medicine, family medicine, or pediatrics. Although I think it's telling that even after the board exam is passed, a very large percentage of those physicians re-enroll, if you will, in the Knowledge Plus program because they find this approach to learning to be efficient and enjoyable. And then the Heart Association product really has really quite revolutionized the way the American Heart Association is able to prepare people for basic life support certification, ACLS, which, advanced cardiac life support, and then PALS, which is the pediatric version. And be able to, instead of having a 2-day class where, you're all off your job and you're in a conference room and have a traditional, lecture format, et cetera, really taking the cognitive content portion and making that adaptive so the student can go through it at their pace. I already mentioned with all my hand gestures, that for someone who's expert in it, that can be very efficient. For someone who's a less expert, it's just as efficient, but takes longer because they need to learn the material. And they can do that at their pace, get what they need to then have a much more abbreviated in-person session where they demonstrate their CPR skills and their teamwork, et cetera. So, I mean, that would probably be, those two examples would probably be the first that come to mind of direct impact on the clinician to be able to say, okay, you need to learn these skills in the case of CPR. It's immediately applicable to the bedside. How can we most efficiently arm you with that material and bridge that gap between virtual classroom, if you're online, or in-person classroom, and then the bedside? Because I think the closer we can bring those two, the better, right? If what you do in your acquisition of new skills and knowledge is very segregated from what you do at the bedside, first of all, I don't think it's as much fun. All of us in healthcare, I'm a pediatrician, so I like fun, but all of us in healthcare want to make what we're doing as applicable immediately to the patient as possible. I think that's probably a fair generalization. And if you can use adaptive learning, use some of these other approaches to really make it real, bring it as close to the bedside as possible. I mean, if not any other thing, if not for any other reason, the student's more engaged. I think that's for sure.
Yeah, and I guess we all have that relatability in looking at sitting at our bedside when we have a moment of time, or sitting at home and ticking through the modules after modules of the mandatory learning that we're doing every year. How much of that learning is actually being ingrained, and how much of that is stuff we already know and then stuff that we would like to know, or is it the way in which the learning's approached? Because the modules seem to be the exact... I think I've been taking the same advanced life support quiz for the last 5-6 years of my career, and maths tests that we do that we still have to do that aren't applicable to our current jobs because they used to use drip rates or drop rates or whatever it is. As a clinician, it seems like a waste of time, a lot of it, which is what I guess we're then talking about, is the application of adaptive learning and how we can apply this to become, one, more efficient, two, better learners, and how we can be better at our jobs, because that's why I guess we're all here.
And just honestly, learning really should be fun, and medicine is fascinating. And so what better potential combination to say, wow, this material is really cool, and it's actually fun and exciting to learn more of it. And, oh, by the way, when I do that, some patient, a kid, or in your case, an adult in the ICU, actually benefits from what I just did. So anybody that does anything, in my humble opinion, to make that less fun, or like hammer you, just give you this same material, shame on them. You're taking something that's great, and you're intentionally, maybe not intentionally, but you're making it a drudgery. There was I'm familiar with a hospital that shall remain nameless, but they literally make coffee cups for their staff for the education week, and it says mandatory education week on the coffee mug. And I always thought it sounds like, I don't know what else is mandatory that you just is drudgery that you have to do. Like, I don't know, nothing fun, right? It sounds like something in prison. I don't know. It sounds terrible. So
no, definitely, I understand that. I guess what I'm looking for to find out more from you is, yes, there's a theoretical point, and this is adaptive learning. We're like online, we're looking at teaching and learning off already built knowledge or individualized pathways for people. How does this better outcomes practically in hospitals, and then how does this better outcomes for therefore our patients and our clinicians, or our staff, I guess, for the people out there who are looking to help better their staff as well as their patients? Can you tell me a bit more about that as the background as a clinician?
I think outcomes in medical education is a very hard nut to crack. And here's why I say that. First of all, what is the ultimate outcome? Even that's hard for many people to define. So in critical care, we like to say the outcome might be survival to hospital discharge after critical illness. So even in the realm outside of education, if we're examining a drug that's intended to raise your blood pressure, for example, and we give that drug, is it fair to say that the outcome was just that the blood pressure went up? Or, which in my mind is like, that's why I gave the drug. Or do I need to show that drug made it so that patient left the hospital 5 days earlier and survived, et cetera? So first of all, understanding the outcome variable we're looking at in educational research, I think, is just an interesting dilemma and an interesting quandary. So how does that relate to adaptive learning, or just medical education in general? Even things like simulation. I've recently reviewed a manuscript that attempted to connect simulation training with improved patient outcomes, and that's still like a real holy grail thing. If you can say, this educational intervention that we did as a hospital or a department, because we did this education, because we learned this material, that next patient had a better outcome. So for adaptive learning, I would say for the near-term outcome, if you have efficiency in your learning, So, and adaptive learning, there's all kinds of data that we have and others have that show that you can have acquisition of the content, you can have learning, have knowledge acquisition in 40% faster time because of the efficiencies that I mentioned in adaptive learning. You don't have to sit through material that you already know well. You very quickly prove that you understand it and you move on. So that freed you up right off the bat. If it was an hour and it only took you 40 minutes, then, go to the bedside. You have more time you have for your patient, or you have more time to maybe cement principles that are harder to understand. So that the near-term endpoint is there for sure. Another near-term endpoint is confirmation of understanding. And that's where I think all of adaptive learning, again, or all of learning, all of not just medical education, but learning in general, and certainly adaptive learning, this conversation that we are changing, we are moving from the old days, and you're young, but you've still caught some of these old days, which are go to this lecture, you've got your nursing, certificate, you're credentialed, but now you need to maintain it. And for what we want you to do is go to a conference hall and sit in the back. You're welcome to text or do whatever you want, chat with your friends. And after an hour, you will attest that you've been present for the lecture. And somehow does that, that's been the paradigm, right, for continuing medical education in many settings. So there's no confirmation at all that you even paid attention. Of course, if you're a professional, you should, but we're humans. So then you move the needle a little bit and you say, okay, why don't you read an article or do some kind of activity, and then I'll ask you a few questions. And then I'm going to say that you're competent. Even that's a stretch, right? If you answered 3 poorly written multiple choice questions, I'm not sure that proves that you understand the material. What we have for this, outcomes endpoint with Rhapsode is 100% confirmation that the student is competent, because in a typical 30-minute educational activity in Rhapsode, we don't have 4 or 5 learning objectives. We have probably 25, at least 20. So the learning objectives are very granular, and the probe, the way we interact with the student is very focused, perfectly focused on that learning objective. So if you answer the question correctly, I know you know it. And that's where we can't have something like a learning objective be, understand the uses of epinephrine in, shock. No, we would have a very focused thing, recall the effect on systolic blood pressure of epinephrine, right? So we hone it way down. So as you're a student, it's not hammered into you like with drudgery, but in the background, what you don't see, the software is going through and really going through all of these learning objectives as it works best for you, left and right, up and down. But it is touching every one of those. And when you've shown that you know it, then we deliver, because your original question was about outcomes. I've kind of been rambling, but then we deliver these outcomes. What were the outcomes? Quicker time to knowledge acquisition, that's for sure, and quicker and guaranteed assurance of competence. That final holy grail is still a little bit of a holy grail. In other words, if you did adaptive learning module in Area 9, did your patient have a better outcome? And depending on where you want to go with the conversation, we're working on that. I'm working with a colleague at Stanford on that specifically in the developing country of Tanzania. So we're working on that for sure.
Yeah, wow. And I guess it's really interesting to hear about the reasons and the drivers for why you would use adaptive learning can be so varied between, I guess, stakeholders and clinicians, and then the outcomes for the patients. I guess when we started this conversation, it was a bit difficult to understand how this was going to be so prevalent in healthcare, but it sounds like it's got so much growth to have within the healthcare department as there is, and that's why we have this podcast. We're talking about how to make the healthcare environment better in Australia and globally, and thinking about how the efficiency of learning, like, it didn't even go there in my mind as a clinician and in the background. So it's really cool, and it's really interesting to hear how these different overlaying parts and interacting different pieces all coming together to actually, build growth and learning for each.
Yeah. And, I would just add to that, I was focusing on the individual student and focusing on the student-patient sort of interaction, instead of student, I should say clinician, professional, medical healthcare professional. But you can take a frame shift back from that too and say, well, what would a department like to know about their staff and their competency in their learning? Or what would a hospital system, or what would an entire hospital, or consortium, or a healthcare consortium, an insurance company, if they want, they can step back and have a huge global picture of all of their employees or all of their professional staff, and really start to do some fun things, which I don't think anyone's really done yet. I've wanted to do for quite a while, but imagine if in preparation for a medical conference where we're going to bring 300 people at expense and everything, fly them in and have the traditional conference. But what if we gave them all an adaptive learning module, all 300 people, to do before that conference? And then, in taking an aggregate, looked at their pathways through that material. We could very quickly start to see, people really understand this. People had a hard time with this. And then finalize the agenda for the conference based on the incredible data that we got by looking at the performance of all of the students. I mean, I just think, I would just love to participate in that. And I guess I should just walk the talk and do a conference like this. But how great would that be if you said, you registered for this conference, and just so you know, we've looked in aggregate at 300 of you who will be attending, and we have now essentially custom curated the content we're going to present at the conference based on what you guys all just showed us. And we're not going to do 20 slides on stuff that you clearly already know. I mean, talk about efficiency. That would just be amazing.
Yeah. And then you think about how that would then feed back into, we talked about outcomes in hospitals, but that's a clear thing. If you have a group of people that have a higher percentage of holes in learning within certain areas, how that then can be drawn and shown, which would show about like patient outcomes, or what we're doing wrong, or where our errors are being caused and why the errors are being caused. For sure, we can say, there's medication errors, or there's, hand hygiene issues if we're talking COVID. Where is that area of learning, and why is that? You'd have both the what and then the why in that. And I think that's probably the crucial point that I've taken out of what you've just explained to me. And that's, you have the what, and then you have the why, in terms of why do people not know this, or why?
Yeah.
And then you can direct your learning specifically.
Yeah. Just these efficiencies build on each other. I mean, at the simplest level, I gave you back 20 minutes of an hour. That's great. Go have a coffee. Maybe, actually, that's valuable too as a busy professional. If you didn't, you met, end of afternoon, you mentioned that you've had the same simple content presented to you 10 times for all these things that we check the box. Do you remember how to wash your hands? And not to belittle it, it's important, but it's such a lost opportunity to say, well, we have to go through this material again for legislative or regulatory reasons. We really believe that you probably know how to, fill in the blank, do these basic things. Let's dispense with that as quickly as possible so we can get to the good stuff, to some fun stuff. I
think all of the above is very much relevant and prevalent currently in healthcare, and preaching to the choir here.
You and me.
So I think just sort of, looking at summarizing what we've gone through here and the different directions in terms of how you can begin in adaptive learning. I know where to start is probably the biggest issue we have in Australian healthcare environment, is the lack of, the willingness for change. We always like to talk about the willingness for change, and during that is the readiness for change, and having those two things, spoken about within something that's I wouldn't say it's new concept, but as you said, it's a concept that is being developed, and it is a software. So therefore it means technology, and how much we don't enjoy changing technology in hospitals or whatever it is. What can we look at, and where can you start with adaptive learning? How is this, let's say we've got a stakeholder, we've got someone who wants to begin the journey of adaptive learning. What does that look like, I guess?
Right now, it's not really available on demand for any individual learner, with the exception of, I guess, I mentioned New England Journal. As soon as I say it, maybe that's not entirely correct. If you went to if you said, I really want to learn, maintain competency or prepare for a board exam, and I want adaptive learning to be the primary tool that I use, then you could seek out some of these things like the couple that I mentioned. But I don't think I'm not an employee of New England Journal Group. I'm not, I have nothing to do with their marketing department, but I would venture a guess that nobody or almost nobody came and called them or sent them an email and said, hey, I'm interested in preparing for the board exam, but I want to make sure it's adaptive learning that I'm going to do. I don't think that was part of it. I think most likely people said, I need to prepare for this exam. I have several options. There's books. There's different. I can go to a lecture, or I can, they have these types of conferences. I want somebody that I can trust the content that's presented. So right now, on the individual student or professional level, I think it's still more, you're fortunate if you get into an environment where adaptive learning principles are used. I think as it becomes more well-known about actually how powerful this technology is, people will start to seek it out. I mentioned this high re-enrollment rate in Knowledge Plus, which was unexpected. You paid to enroll in this course to pass the board exam. You passed your board exam. You're done. But yet people re-enrolling, and that was such a powerful bit of information I got when I learned that wow, people must really truly enjoy the experience, that they're happy to re-enroll even though they've already crossed the finish line. It's like running a race. You cross the finish line, you're like, that race was so much fun, I'm just going to run that 10K again. It's like kind of crazy to me. So I think as people learn more about these technologies and use them and enjoy them, they may start to seek them out. And remember, each day that goes past, there are fewer people that are not digital native. Really, if there was early in this process some barriers to interaction with this kind of material because you're using either a mobile device or you're using a laptop or something, that those days just melt away. That's the march of time as it goes forward. It won't be too long. I mean, already you've seen these things where they show like a teenage kid a CD, and say, do you have any idea what this is? They have no idea what that is. I have a little 10-year-old, and he just loves just like what was a Walkman? Did you have a Discman? Stuff like that. So the tide is going this way, and I think we're all going to be more engaged in using technology in our learning, and adaptive learning. Just as much as I can predict the future, it will be a key part of that future, I think. Yeah,
and it sounds like your passion for it and the way that you've, I guess, fallen into it really has been a lovely, I guess, shadow of how intriguing it is and how it can be so useful in a background as a clinician, as a learner, as a patient. Really, it's pretty amazing to have, I guess, that whole picture on it. So Marc, we mentioned before about if I was a healthcare provider or a healthcare professional and I wanted to engage, or how would I be able to begin adaptive learning pathway?
We talked, I'm sort of describing at the individual level what it would be like to be a student to to sort of seek out and find a adaptive learning product. And I've mentioned a couple of successful ones that we've had. I think if you take a step larger than that and say, well, what if I'm a hospital? What if I'm a hospital system or a clinic? And I wanted to take some of the content that we already have and make that adaptive and just try to sort of move this, move into the future. How does that go? It's actually quite a fun process. You can tell I keep bringing up this word fun. I like having fun when I do these things. So when we've worked with some smaller partners sometimes in the US and in Europe, and the barrier to entry is low. So we say, why don't you come up with, I used to say, why don't you come up with your most dry material and let's just shoot for that efficiency factor and just kind of get people through get them out of this dry material as quickly as possible. But that's really a sort of a pessimistic way to look at it. So now when I'm in these early discussions with, usually a chief learning officer or in a smaller organization, it could just be an education department. I say, what's some material that you really feel is great, that you're really most proud of? And usually there's a local author, sometimes a nurse, sometimes a doctor, very often a PowerPoint. But do you have a champion? Do you have a champion in your organization that just really loves this material? Okay, when we find that, now we're going to have some great energy of someone that's really excited to do something, a little more forward thinking. Let's get together with them, and invariably it's a 15-minute PowerPoint, something like that. And I think I had mentioned earlier, but it's very different how we do learning objectives. We'll sit down with the author and they'll say, well, I've got 5 learning objectives. And we'll say, let's really go granular because we need to come up with probes that match all these. But we just go through this process and sort of start out with a blueprint where, what are the learning objectives going to be? Where does your great content fit into that? Area 9 have learning engineers that work in Rhapsode. There's always the option as companies have the ability or the desire to have a local person learn how to author in Rhapsode. It's actually quite easy to do. There's ironically an adaptive learning course that teaches you how to make adaptive learning courses, which is sort of a meta kind of cool idea. So we actually have this thing called Area 9U, Area 9 University, and students work through that, become proficient in making adaptive learning courses, and in the process of becoming certified in that, they make their first adaptive learning course. And it's at the end of their training, that course is ready to go. So especially smaller organizations love doing that, even large organizations. You work through the process, you learned how to do it, and your final class project is actually ready to ship, if you will, so to speak, to your organization. So I enjoy it. It's fun. So it's the process is interesting for the people involved because it is something new, and they get to right away see how things come together, and you don't have to do the big leap and say, oh my gosh, we have 200 courses, and how much time and effort is it going to take? You start with a good one. You see how the response is. Invariably, it's well received, frankly, because again, students like yourself, professionals like yourself, recognize something that's different, and then we just sort of build from there. So that's usually how that goes.
Yeah, well, great. And I think the journey that you're describing is, I guess, like a sample size. And I think that's, as long as you don't need to completely change an entire system, which is what scares the Australian healthcare, I guess, environment and landscape, because it's currently what they're trying to do is change entire systems within hospitals because the interoperability is mind-blowing. So I think that as long as there's a sample size and you're able to have a bite and have a look at the outcomes. And then talking about outcomes, you sort of mentioned Tanzania as a bit of a sample size that you're using, or a country that you're using adaptive learning in. And can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's it's been a very interesting project. So I came to Stanford, I mentioned, I think at the start, about 7 years ago. And a colleague of mine who I've known for years on his work at the Heart Association, Dr. Peter Meany, came about a year later. And so we've done some work at the Heart Association, and he's very interested in global health. He's very active. He's done some groundbreaking work in Botswana, where he contextualized heart association material, basically the advanced life support material, to that local environment, which just completely makes sense and is so often overlooked. So if your course book says you would now put a patient on a ventilator, but in this particular environment there is not a ventilator, that's a huge disconnect. So Pete did some great stuff and published some work there. And then one day we were literally sitting in the office just pre-corona, and he said, I got a little grant, and I'm trying to see if there might be someone on campus who could make me some software. And then he proceeded to basically describe what is Rhapsode. He's like, it would just be great if I could have my content there and it could adapt to the students. And it was almost laughable. And, I was like, Pete, actually, we were, yeah, exactly. So just a nice chance encounter here, because, I know a company that really does this great stuff and great work, and they do exactly what you described, and they've been working on it for over 20 years. And two of the founders of Area 9 are computer scientists, so it's not just a smart undergraduate alone trying to figure something out. It's a real amazingly powerful software shop, used by I think it's something like 40 million students have used Area 9 software in their learning. So anyway, what was great is I was able to help just get the handshake with Pete and Area 9, and they've entered into that with a philanthropic eye, and so they have kept the cost very low to do this. And so my involvement has been less as a global health researcher, because I haven't been. I'm interested in it, but it hasn't been my expertise, and more as someone who's interested in educational technology. So we're a couple years into the project. We've contextualized, the royal we, but Pete and his team, and specifically his colleagues in Tanzania, are creating, I mentioned, or I would talk about, the development of specific products. So you can have local people learning how to make adaptive learning software products, and that's been done. So those people in Tanzania are local experts, which is what you got to have. I don't know what you need. You know what you need. I mean, that just seems so obvious. And so this is being rolled out in, it's called Pediatric Acute Care Education, the PACE program with the Pediatric Association of Tanzania. And it's being, all the typical barriers to I don't want to say progress, but, the things we take for granted, a well-established highway system, a well-established transportation hub and backbone, et cetera, all of that stuff. Those are challenges in a place like Tanzania. So to get out to rural hospitals with textbooks or, laptops is a challenge. You can leapfrog over all of that with adaptive learning. Create the content. People are using it on their mobile phones. People are using it through their cell phone networks. It's amazing. And we're seeing, we will be publishing these results, but and I haven't seen the final data yet. I know the adoption data is great and the users are enjoying it, and really hope to be able to publish that this intervention actually improves patient outcomes, which is the outcome we're looking for here. So we will be looking at, rates of diagnosis of acute illness in children, rapidity of treatment, adherence to treatment protocols, all of these awesome things that you learn, and then you want to say, did I take that directly to the bedside? So that's in a big nutshell, that's what we're doing there, and it's pretty fun stuff.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing that we all care about, which is patient outcomes. So
yeah, if you keep a laser focus on that, then all the rest sort of falls into place. And oppositely, if you lose that focus, then you're just somebody who's working on a computer, I guess. I mean, not to be go too fine a point on it, but it's great to keep the focus on the patient.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, thanks, Marc. It's great.
Thank you.
This is Talking HealthTech with me, Peter Birch, featuring content and community about technology in healthcare.